Welcome back, everybody. This is not a Malazan video. This is me talking about The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien, which I have recently reread again for the, I don't know, 10th time or so, maybe more, probably more at this point. And I figured it's time to talk a bit about it and look at why I think treating it as just a children's tale is wrong, because I believe that. I would love to have made this video outside. It's a very blustery day, and as I've learned from that a very important book that everyone should read, going out on a blustery day is not a good idea. So we're not going to go out and wish everybody a happy Wednesday. We're going to do something else, which is talk about The Hobbit. So here we go. Cheers. So right, this is obviously a full spoiler talk about it, because I believe spoiling a book that is almost a century old with like movies that were terrible but also almost a decade old is, you know, if you haven't read it by now or at least, you know, have picked up most of the story through talking to other people, then go and read that damn book. It's not that long. It's actually, I feel like almost reading the book takes less time than watching all 3 terrible movies. But enough of that. So, The Hobbit. For a lot of, I feel like over the years, it has had the reputation of being a mere kind of children's book or a prequel to The Lord of the Rings and so forth. And I feel that's doing the book a disservice. So I'm going to try to explain why I feel there's more to it and why I feel it's well worth reading The Hobbit on its own. Or I guess probably rereading it after a while. So let's start. Like, for some reason, the perception of Tolkien's works in fantasy reader circles or the wider public over the, like, I don't know, 60, 70 years people have been talking about Tolkien at this point, is very limited in a way. It's a very simplified version. It's basically The Lord of the Rings is the beginning of fantasy stories and the, you know, the text for fantasy literature. The Silmarillion is basically the Bible for Tolkien fans, and The Hobbit is that children's tale and prequel. And this is obviously all wrong. We all know that. I hope we all know that. Otherwise, I'll try to explain. Now, I'm not going to go into why, obviously, the assessment of The Lord of the Rings as being that first fantasy book is bullshit. Because, yeah, I've spoken about that before. Other people who are much more eloquent have spoken about it before, and so forth. It is certainly a very important text and has certainly had a huge impact on fantasy literature ever since, whether it comes from everyone trying to write a trilogy these days, to all these other things that we have in there, but that's one thing. The Silmarillion is obviously also not the Bible. It's a lot of things, but it's not the fucking Bible of Tolkien's works. It might be something more akin to the Kalevala of, or something like that, but that's, you know, another thing. Maybe a topic for another video. And The Hobbit is much more than just a prequel or a children's story. First of all, the idea of a prequel is something that has, I don't know, is a result of the commodification of stories, of entertainment over the last 50 years or so. It also kind of implies that you have first that magnum opus and then you start to look into the back and, you know, look back in history and write these things, whether it is your whatever that thing is that Jordan wrote for the Wheel of Time. I always want to say A Sense of Spring, but it's wrong. It's something with spring, though, that thing, or whether it is Brian Herbert, you know, robbing the corpse of his father's work, every dignity, by going out and writing tons and tons and tons of absolutely atrocious stories about Dune to cash in on it or something else. George Lucas going and, putting the axe to his cinematic legacy. That's not the point. Those things were all written after the main text was already out there, and that's not the case with the Lord of the Rings. The Hobbit was the first published story in Middle Earth there, and that's important because it shows us, prior to the Lord of the Rings, what Tolkien does, and can help us understand what the Lord of the Rings does later on. So it makes a lot of sense to read it as such and read it before the Hobbit, the Lord of the Rings, obviously. You can read it the other way around and you can pick up things here and there as well, but that's, I feel it is important to understand that this is a book that can stand on its own. It has certain aspects that make it easier, to enter the world because it's much smaller in scope and all of these things. It also may make it because of all these dwarves with all these funny names and the little hobbit and all of that. It can feel a little more like a children's story, or at least young adult, or children's story, really. It's sort of the perception that I've picked up over the times. And that's obviously bullshit because a ton of people get slaughtered in that in rather brutal ways, but apparently that has become acceptable for children's stories at this point as well, as long as there's also talking animals and dwarves with funny names. Disney be thanks. But so it's, while it has that, I feel what it actually does and where it actually gets his ideas from, and it's rather more whimsical tone comes from other places, and I feel that's sort of what I wanted to talk about today. Now, on its surface, it is very much a travel narrative. It might even be more of a travel narrative along the lines of your hero's journey than the Lord of the Rings may be, although a lot of people trying to talk about, the hero's journey and Campbell pick up Lord of the Rings to explain it, but the Hobbit is much more that. He's a reluctant hero. He goes out, he brings something back, and so forth. It kind of works if you want to do that. I don't want to do that here, though. What I want to do is say, yes, it is a travel narrative, but it is much more. What it really is a number of individual adventures, episodes held together by sort of shorter, mostly shorter, travel episodes in between. If you go through the chapters, the book has 19 chapters. You go through it, you have, near the end, you have all these, have the big battle. You have your first, smaller adventure, which would be chapter 2, which is roast mutton, that story with the trolls, which is cool. Then you have your first pause when they go to meet Elrond, and then you have your next adventure, which is obviously the stuff happening in the Misty Mountains when they get picked up by the goblins. I'm going to use the word goblin here because that's what Tolkien used here, and that's when we stick here. I'm not going to go into whether goblins are orcs and how those terms. That's something for Tolkien scholars. I'm not one of them. I don't even want to be one of them. But so we have the next big adventure, which would be what happens under the Misty Mountains and stays under the Misty Mountains. Then you have something of a smaller travel interlude kind of thing, which would be that chapter, which is called Out of the Frying Pan into the Fire. Yes, that one, with the eagles picking them up and so forth. Then you have a larger episode, which would be staying at Bjorn's. Then you have your set piece thing at Mirkwood with the elves and them getting out of there, which I would consider is either 2 or 1 adventure kind of thing. Then you have a travel, the end of a travel interlude kind of thing, which would be them going to Lake Town and them going up to the mountain. Then you obviously have first the encounters with the dragon, first with Bilbo and the dragon, then obviously the death of the dragon. And then you have your final one, which is the Battle of 5 Armies. Why am I going through this right now, event by event? My point is, and this is, you can call it metafiction if you want. My point is the entire story of this book, the entire novel, is much more a like built along the oral tradition, which you can tell when you start reading it with the narrator putting all these asides, talking directly to the audience and explaining things as an aside and making dumb jokes as an aside and stuff like that. This story is written as if it was told to you by someone, as if it was told in that oral tradition, and that is important. Unfortunately, nowadays we feel that we kind of associate the idea of a story being told like oral, like narration, like told out loud. We associate that with children. Like we tell fairy tales to our children, we tell stories to our children. Well, I don't, because I don't have children. That's a different point. And that has, over like a while now, led to the point where we kind of, yes, associate that with also with children's stories and give those, I don't know, some kind of less weight in a way than like stories for adults that we read in proper books and shit like that. But obviously, up to fairly recently in human history, depending on where you live, even up to like the today, a lot of like traditional storytelling has been oral and not in writing. And I feel it's important to look at these traditions of storytelling in here with The Hobbit in a way, because that can kind of help to understand why some of these stories are like those smaller details. And this, okay, I'm running ahead of myself here, so let's go back into how that works. So the thing is, with these oral traditions of stories, you have an abundance of different versions of these stories, because those stories depend on the storyteller at that day, your bard, your skald, whatever you want to call them, your Greek poet or whatever, right? It depends on those persons, and it depends on the audience, because this is a performance normally. You perform for your audience that story. So you read the room and maybe add in or drop out a few things. Maybe add in a few asides to make sure your audience understands what you want to tell them. All of these aspects, like every retelling of a story was usually is unique, right? It depends on all these things. It also means that you have like that framework of a story, and there's different versions where sometimes another adventure is added in and sometimes maybe not, or sometimes, yeah. So those are different. And what we read and how we can read The Hobbit here means this is basically someone sitting there and writing down the telling of that story by someone else. And it's that specific version that we get. It obviously means that listening to this as an audiobook is immensely helpful, and can like bring this across even more, because you have all these songs in between and stuff like that. This all like is part of like a performance. Like view it and read it as if it were a performance of that old story of that Hobbit. And this gives us a hint where Tolkien is coming from and what Tolkien is doing. Because Tolkien, at this point, is taking it, like as later on, obviously, as well. And it's been commented on a lot, and people compare it to Beowulf and stuff like that. Like, not The Hobbit, but more like Lord of the Rings. But the point is, Tolkien is taking these traditional stories, these traditional tales that we have when we, I don't know, read the whole like Song of the Nibelungenlied. When you read that, there's like Siegfried and the dragon and stuff like that, that later on gets turned into the Ring of the Nibelungs opera cycle by Wagner and changed around again. But those, once again, are stories that were told like as live performances, and you have these different episodes fit together, whether they, fit or not. And we find a lot of these elements with the Lord of the Rings, and obviously as well, this is my point, with The Hobbit. This is not just a funny story, and even though we may find the dwarven names kind of, I don't know, funny or childish nowadays because if they are like similarities in sounding. You have like Oin and Gloin and Bifer, Bofer, Bomber, and Dory, Nori, Ori, and so forth. And this is once again, I guess, one of those things where we can blame Disney, which, we can do for a lot of things, and they deserve it. But for example, Dvalin is a dwarven name that we find in Norse writings as well. Those are not exactly specially funny names when it comes to tradition. No, they're not. And they are, and this is something that we see at the end of the battle when Thorin and his friends come out and they start killing orcs like it's nobody's business. Those are not just your hi-ho singing dwarves that bandage wounded animals in the forest, as Terry Pratchett would put it. Those are rather, those are rather tough dwarves in the end. So yeah, we should look at traditional folk tales, legends, and myths of a mostly Germanic origin in this case. And I feel obviously there's elements that are taken quite directly from there. For example, when you go and look at the singing birds and being able to understand animals once you wear your magic ring and stuff like that, and a bird talking about that one spot underneath, like on the left breast of Smaug, that Bard then can shoot the arrow in. Like if you read your Siegfried tale, you know that he's doing. We have these motifs of invulnerability, except for one spot. The idea of talking that animals, or in this case birds, tell your hero, the hero, what he can do. We have those motifs all over that place, and reading The Hobbit in that fashion, I feel, can help a lot, because this is not just a happy little tale about a happy little hobbit. Just because that guy is not like 7 foot tall doesn't mean he's not a serious person. And I feel this is important to understand here. Then we find other aspects in there that are very much reminiscent of tale-telling, of historical tale-telling. A few of those are the riddle competition. This is like a perfect example for that, because those riddles are like traditional folk riddles, and your tale-telling bard, skald, or whatever could like extend or shorten that like whole chapter by a few more riddles or a few less riddles depending on the evening. He could switch out some of those riddles if he'd want to, and that will work. Something similar you have with later on when the dwarves are sitting in there in the tunnel, and while Smaug is raging outside, and they start talking about the treasures that they remember from old that should be down there in the Lonely Mountain. And you have this relatively short but still extensive list of all kinds of treasures that never get mentioned again. The spears forged for this king but never taken, and the golden cup of Thror, and all this stuff. When you go through like stories that have come down to us through oral history before they were written down, you have a lot of these things. They're in there because it's easier, like sort of easier for the tale-teller to remember these things if you can't have like stuff coming in, I don't know, 3s and 5s and 7s and so forth. Plus you can add in another 1, 2, 3, 4 items that you want to talk there about depending on the mood, right? Another one of these aspects, I would say, is the way Gandalf goes and tells the story to Bjorn, the skin changer, and how he splits it up into 1, 3, and like extends that. That's very much how you do tale telling. So I feel that a lot of these aspects in there are deliberately put in there because Tolkien obviously knew how these kind of traditions work. When of course he read Beowulf and translated it, and he translated Sir Gawain and the Green Knight at some point. He also read the Kalevala, and the Kalevala was exactly produced like that, with Elias Lönnrot going from village to village and listening to tale tellers and writing that stuff down. So I feel It really helps understand The Hobbit as a serious book, not just for children, because if you like take that into account, into consideration. All right, let's talk about something more. The whimsy, the funny. Yes, there are a lot of these asides that sound like the story is told to a child. But once again, I feel this is maybe partly due to the book being old at this point and to Tolkien's background. We should look at that. Like, we know, and when we read Tolkien's stuff, we know that he is, well, he was conservative, and that brings its own problems in there. But what it also means is that he comes from a place, oftentimes in his writing, where he thinks that the harmless, whimsical country life of the rather well-off English gentleman, like your gentry, basically, is the ideal he wants to get to. I mean, look at these hobbits. Bilbo Baggins is basically gentry. He doesn't have a job. He has a huge house and a lot of money. He just sits there and wastes it with the typical stuff that your average English country gentleman in the like 19th century mostly did. Like, you know, well, he doesn't go hunting, but he plays darts and quoits and all this stuff, and he has a huge garden. He can pay a gardener. He just lays about, which I get it, it's fun. But he's ripped out of that. But that's sort of a tone that we find in there again and again. And that is reflected in the language from time to time. It's this whimsy that we have associated with children, with childishness, but it's not. It's like, I don't know, you go and read your Mr. Norrell and Jonathan Strange, or whatever that book was called, and read that language. That's a similarly whimsical language, and though it's a fantasy book or a genre fiction book in a way, it's certainly not a children's story as such. So I feel these sort of things that you find in your asides when the narrator says, like, after he has that first scene with the trolls talking to each other, and you have that aside like, yes, I'm afraid trolls talk like that. It's like, yeah, you know, it comes from that perspective of 19th century upper middle class, lower upper class kind of whimsy that you have in mind there. And then, yes, you have Tolkien, you have Bilbo Baggins being ripped out of that and forced to face the reality of the world out there. It's good and it's bad, which is something that, you know, happened to a lot of people at the time, mainly obviously during the First World War, which brought a lot of people in contact with reality, but obviously also other things. And I'm not going to go and talk about like allegory and stuff like that. We all know that Tolkien really hated that. And as I said, I'm not a Tolkien scholar. I just want to point out these things. I also want to point out that there's a bunch of really cool, like, sort of modern jokes in there. I love that. The dumbest one is probably that story about Bull Roarer Took hitting the Goblin King Golfimble with a club and knocking his head off into a rabbit hole, and thus inventing the game of golf. And dude, that's great comedy right there. Seriously. Because it breaks that idea of a lot of fantasy stories. This is a story that happened a while ago, and it's told to us by somebody, and he adds in those jokes. There's later on something when he's talking about the post office, and at some point the voice of Bjorn is compared to guns and drums, and there is no guns in Middle Earth, but that's not the point, right? This is told to us about some time ago. So we need to explain things in modern language to make sure that these things work. And that makes The Hobbit a rather modern tale as well. Well, modern by the time it was written, which is, 1930. But yeah, I feel that's important. Also, there's these short kind of social commentaries that I feel are important. there's this small bit when Smaug is getting angry because he noticed that he has that Bilbo has stolen the cup, and you go there and he explodes, and it's like the anger that you can only get from rich people who have more than they need when they find that they've lost something they never used. And don't tell me that's not social commentary right there. Now, I'm obviously far away from calling Tolkien a left winger or anything like that. I feel it's a different thing that you find in there, also in the description of the Lakeman, especially the master of Lake Town, who is apparently mostly a crafty capitalist. I feel that also fits in there because a suspicion against everything capitalist, everything mercantile, is also part of this like gentry, whimsical gentry, lower nobility kind of background that you feel there. The suspicion of money in a way, which is something that you get not only on the left but also on the right, like not on the right, but with really conservative people. It's like you don't talk about money, you don't. It's considered something vulgar, and I feel that that's sort of more where this suspicion of like the merchants in Lake Town and that idea of Smaug kind of comes from in a way. But I feel it's important to notice that the such tones are in there. It's not just, as I said, hi ho singing dwarfs, bandaging wounded animals. It's a lot more. All right. What else to talk about with this book? As I said, I feel it's important to read that. If you want to read Tolkien in general, if you don't want to bother with that, then be my guest. But why are you still watching this video? I just feel that it's important to read The Hobbit as more than just a children's book to get a sense of where Tolkien's coming from. This is your more like shorter tale told to you, and when you then go to Lord of the Rings and it's like long trilogy, that's your big epic in the same world, with maybe a little less of the whimsy in there, although there are still thinking foxes in there, which is the best thing ever in Fellowship of the Rings. But we get introduced to a lot of themes in a light-hearted way. But nevertheless, this is a serious story, and the stakes are still brutally high. And yes, oh yeah, right. The ending when Bilbo comes back and you have the auction and everything. Once again, Tolkien had a keen sense also of the whimsy and the whimsical nature, and also the darker side of that, of the small-mindedness of this culture that he's describing there when he's talking about the hobbits, which is sort of this gentry, rural England of years gone by that he kind of obviously misses in part, but also he's aware of the small-mindedness because he is someone who has been out of that world and has seen more of it, more stuff. He's also seen poverty and shit, right? He knows more, so he sees the ridiculous aspects of it as well when he talks about how long it takes for Bilbo to be declared alive again and stuff like that. So there is that sense to it as well. And just in general, the whole way he describes the end of Lake Town, when it's burnt down, when the dragon dies, and that scene afterwards with Bard and the Master, there's more like awareness of how human behavior works in there than you might give it credit. Give Tolkien credit, definitely more than you might give him credit. Give The Hobbit credit after watching the movie, because that was a disaster, and probably more than you may have given it credit in your memory if you've only read it as a child. Yes, so I guess with these words, I'm gonna end this for today. I really, really enjoy. I mean, for me, the Hobbit is a comfort read. I read it because I've read it so many times, it feels like coming home. I listened to the old audiobook with Rob Inglis reading and singing the songs and everything, and it's glorious. But it's also something that where every time I read it, I discover some small bit where I'm like, oh right, this is in there. This is fun, but it's also smart, and there's all this other stuff going on. And I feel that's, once again, that's like a good thing. And I hope maybe watching this video will give you the impulse to go and reread The Hobbit and discover some of those things in there as well, and see it as more of a performance with that like almost metafictional level like on it, that second layer of it being a performance of that older story told to you. Thus you have these individual adventures put together with these smaller interludes where everyone can go to the bar and get another beer while your skald is telling something that's not that important and so forth, right? So yeah, I guess the end of this today is go read The Hobbit from time to time, and you might be astonished what you can actually discover in there. Also, next time you play golf, think about the Goblin Wars and Bullroarer Took. Yeah, and that's it for today. Until then, cheers.